I'm Callista.
And I'm Teresa, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime.
We're continuing with our theme on religious leaders who kill family members with another man who was cheating on his wife with a female member of his congregation. But this man didn't bring a bloody end to his marriage himself. Oh no, Rabbi Fred Neulander delegated the dirty work to two other men as he solidified his alibi. So hold your breath, we're diving into a murder conspiracy plot.
Around 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday, November 1st, 1994, Fred Neulander, the co-founder and senior rabbi of Congregation Makor Shalom in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, a suburb of Philadelphia, walked into his living room and discovered his wife, 52-year-old Carol Neulander, lying on the floor of their home. She was badly injured, and the ground around her was covered with blood. Fred called 911, but the woman with whom he had three children, Rebecca, Matthew, and Benjamin, wouldn't live to celebrate their 29th wedding anniversary in only 8 weeks' time. It took hardly any time at all before authorities started giving Fred the side eye. His behavior wasn't doing him any favors. When police asked why his suit, in fact, his entire person, was free from even a drop of blood after finding his wife, he explained it away by saying that he hadn't tried to help her. Rather than claiming he knew nothing could save her, he said his wife's bloody body repulsed him so much that he couldn't bring himself to attempt life-saving measures.
If that doesn't sound like the reaction you'd imagine having to discovering a loved one gravely injured, you won't be surprised to learn that Fred hadn't shown his wife any love or loyalty in quite some time.
I mean, he couldn't even muster the effort to pretend that he cared for her at all.
Yeah, he's not even doing the bare minimum. That's because the main object of Fred's affection at the time wasn't his wife, but a woman named Elaine Sonsini. Rabbi Fred Neulander had begun lusting after Elaine nearly 2 years earlier when, in December 1992, he came to see her and her Jewish husband, Ken Garland, in the hospital where Ken was being treated in his final days to offer prayers and sympathy.
That's pretty classy. Lusting after the soon to be widow.
Almost as classy as Matt Baker trying to sexually assault a woman who came to visit the family while Cassidy was in the hospital.
Oh my God, that's right. All these men are the scum of the earth.
That they are. Upon her husband's passing, Elaine, who was already doing well as the host of a show at a Philadelphia radio station, inherited more than $1 million from Ken. Maybe her wealth was attractive, or maybe Fred thought a newly widowed woman would be more open to his advances.
Maybe it was both.
It probably was both. But whatever drove him, helpful Fred made the arrangements for Ken's burial, then officiated it himself on December 13th, 1992. Having done his somber duty, Fred noticed Elaine leaving her husband's gravesite and decided to ask if he could call. She said he could, and Fred phoned her that evening.
Hitting on her at her husband's gravesite sounds like a real low.
It sure does. I'm not sure if he was obvious in his intentions then, but I don't think he went into the relationship looking for a friend.
Definitely not. A few days after her husband's burial, Fred called Elaine again, and this time he asked if she wanted to grab lunch. Elaine did him one better. She told him to come over to her house for a home cooked meal. So, on December 21st, that's exactly what Fred did. Having eaten lunch and stayed over for a couple of hours, Fred started to go on his way. But before he made it through the doorway, he asked Elaine one more question. This time, he wanted to know if he could kiss her. She consented, they kissed, and Fred said he wanted to do this again. 3 days later, he came back to her house and they had sex, starting their affair in earnest. After a year had passed, their passion hadn't died. Fred and Elaine were sleeping together nearly every day and calling each other up to 10 times per day. Even though their frequent trysts were risky, they took measures to hide their affair. such as by having sex in Fred's office to take advantage of the door's deadbolt and concealing Fred's car in Elaine's garage when he went over to her place. On top of the sexual encounters that Fred fit in around temple services, the two fanned the flames of their desire by exchanging love letters. I mean, it was the early 90s and sexting didn't exist.
Good point. Polaroids did, though.
Ew, gross, that they did.
I know, sorry for the mental image. Their feelings only grew, and in March 1994, Elaine converted to Judaism and became a member of Fred's Reform Jewish synagogue, Congregation Makor Shalom, which had become one of the biggest congregations in South Jersey since Fred had founded it in 1974, growing to include around 1,000 families. But their shared faith wasn't enough of a commitment for Fred, who was jealous that Elaine was seeing other men. By that summer, Elaine was also becoming unsatisfied with their secret relationship. She wanted to be with someone she didn't have to worry about being seen with. Fed up, she told Fred that when the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, she would be done, free to move into 1995 and pursue a relationship she didn't have to feel ashamed of. Fred was not on board with this plan. He began crying and begging Elaine not to leave him. But was he prepared to leave his wife for Elaine, if she really meant that much to him? Of course not. Although the couple fantasized about the shared life they could lead if Carol wasn't in the picture, Fred couldn't risk losing his position at the synagogue. Even being with Elaine wasn't worth that. Beyond getting fired, Fred convinced Elaine that he just couldn't put his children or his congregation through a divorce. That said, he also wasn't prepared for their affair to end.
We should also note that Reform Judaism, of which Makor Shalom was part, recognizes diversity and embraces inclusion, such as when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. In line with this progressive attitude, a get, which is a bill of divorce specific to the Jewish faith, given to a wife by her husband or on his behalf, and without which the woman is still seen as married to him, is not part of Reformed Judaism in the U.S. Divorce is considered a civil matter, meaning that it is not seen as a sin. That's not to say it's the preferred solution, but it is recognized as a sometimes necessary end to a failing marriage. Even if it might not have been a pleasant process, Fred simply wasn't going to consider this very viable option. Instead, he asked Elaine to just hang in there, trust me. He promised her that they would be a real couple by the time her birthday came around on December 17th, 1994. How exactly would that materialize if he wasn't getting a divorce? Well, Fred made several concerning comments. He told Elaine he wanted Carol's car to fall into the river and for her to magically disappear. He even said that he dreamed that violence was coming to Carol. And how very spiritual of him.
Right? Soon, Fred was proven to be prophetic. On November 2nd, 1994, Elaine was where she was most mornings, hard at work at the WPEN radio station. This was hardly an average day, though, because it soon became the day that she learned that Carol, her lover's wife, had been found murdered the prior evening. At 8:30 that morning, the recently widowed Fred called Elaine. He told Elaine, not even a day after he found his wife, that he couldn't lose her. A couple of weeks after that, he pushed Elaine to remember to trust him. While there had been a brief moratorium on their sex life, their activities started up again not long after Carol's murder. Really romantically, a little over a week after his wife's death on November 10th, 1994, Fred told Elaine he wanted to marry her as soon as appropriately possible. He added that the police investigation into his wife's murder was getting crazy, and Elaine would probably be questioned soon. In preparation for this interrogation, Fred told Elaine to say that he was just her rabbi who had comforted her after her husband's death and helped her convert to Judaism.
When Elaine was first questioned by the police on December 5th, 1994, a little over a month after Carol's murder, She followed Fred's instructions and didn't reveal their affair. The police knew what the rabbi was up to, though, and filled Elaine in on the relationships he was having with other women,
Hypocrisy is in full swing.
which has been the case with almost every religious leader we have covered.
Too true.
Understandably upset, Elaine confronted Fred the following day and let him know of her plan to tell the police the truth. Fred asked her to let him get her a lawyer, but Elaine visited her own lawyer and they set up a meeting with the police for the next day. When Fred called to tell her that he had gotten her an attorney, Elaine told him she had already gone to the police and confessed the affair. Fred went silent, and Elaine took the opportunity to officially end their ill fated, almost 2 year long affair, which was because she was angry that he had been cheating on her. Oh, the irony, not because she thought he had anything to do with his wife's death.
It's not great, but I think at this point she didn't know about his involvement.
I mean, I guess that's probably true. But back before their passion faded in June 1993, Fred had met a man called Leonard Jenoff. The 47-year-old hadn't led a straightforward life and was looking for guidance from a figure in a religion he had never felt comfortable in. Len believed his difficulties had begun when he was still a kid in Atlantic City. His older brother had been given a bar mitzvah, but young Len didn't have the opportunity to learn Hebrew or receive a Jewish education. These missed opportunities made him feel like an inferior Jew.
Len's struggles had continued into adulthood when his first marriage ended in 1970. Although he had a son with his second wife, whom he married in 1973, everything began to fall apart in 1986. He and his second wife had been living in Mapleshade, New Jersey, when Len was in a car accident that led to the death of an 18-year-old boy. Len turned to alcohol as he grappled with this tragedy, and soon his coping mechanism took over his life. He started relying on it on a daily basis. After it began interfering with his work as a private investigator, he was fired in 1991. With his professional life already in tatters, his personal life imploded when his wife took his son and left Len only months later in July. By the end of that year, Len knew something had to shift. Having tasted alcohol for the last time on December 19th, 1991, he entered AA. In addition to his regular Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, he also moved into a Cherry Hill group home for those recovering from alcohol use disorder in April 1992. Given his complicated history with Judaism, he told his AA sponsor that he was going to look into Christianity. Then, in June 1993, Rabbi Neulander reached out to him.
Len had made unquestionable progress. He had even undergone counseling for low self esteem, but his life, like everyone else's, wasn't problem free. He hadn't got financial assistance from Jewish Family Services, and his house was in foreclosure. When he first met Fred in his office at Congregation Makor Shalom, Fred listened attentively to his struggles. The rabbi comforted Len and said there was no reason for him to feel any shame about not having had a bar mitzvah. As kind as Fred was, Len still fell back on his old lies, those detailing his training at the FBI National Academy, his work as a counterterrorism agent in the CIA, and his involvement with the Iran-Contra affair. Len had been touting this impressive backstory since the 1970s, following his return home from the Army Reserves, when he began naming the Central Intelligence Agency on his resume and attempting to join the Mossad with the help of an acquaintance in South Jersey law enforcement. This invented fake life seemed like the antidote to his low self esteem and humdrum existence. And a PSA to everyone, if someone is actually in the CIA, they aren't going to tell you.
If someone's bragging about being a spy, it's either a lie or a hell of a double bluff.
Whether Fred bought into it or not, he and Len continued to talk. And in their third meeting, Len accepted Fred's offer to start coming to Friday night services so that Fred could offer him weekly counseling. Fred made Len feel better about himself. He was his rabbi, but also his friend and mentor.
Len still attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings on a daily basis, so it seemed like the pieces of his life were falling into place when Beginning in March 1994, AA meetings began being held at Makor Shalom on Tuesdays from 7 to 8 in the evening. Now, Len could come to Fred's synagogue at 5 p.m. to meet with him. Then, along with helping get things ready for the meeting, Len would use the time to chat with Fred when they took a turn around the parking lot. As they walked, they would talk about whatever came up, such as Len's hope of working for the Mossad. I mean, he had worked for the CIA after all, so surely the Israelis would snatch him up.
I'm sure there is no kind of vetting process.
Intelligence services are known for just taking anyone. Well aware of Len's ambition, Fred already knew the answer to his question when, in the early spring of 1994, he asked Len if he would be willing to kill for the state of Israel. After Len told Fred that besides his son, Fred, who had done so much for him, was the most important person in his life, Fred casually commented that maybe someday you could do a favor for me. To which Len replied that he would be happy to.
Around a month later, at the end of April 1994, Fred took it a step further when he explicitly told Len that there was an enemy of the state of Israel among them in Cherry Hill who had to be eliminated. Around a week later, Fred came right out and asked Len if he would be up to eliminating this evil entity out to destroy those of the Jewish faith. Fred turned his attention fully to Len, latched on to his elbow, and asked if he was talking to the right person. Afraid but eager to please, Len told his rabbi that he was. Len would find out later that the person Fred wanted dead was actually his wife. She may not have posed a problem to Israel, but she certainly did when it came to Fred's affair with Elaine. But for now, Len's agreement was all Fred needed. So he took him to his home in the Wexford Lees neighborhood in Cherry Hill to continue planning the murder. In the many murderous meetings that followed, Fred kept asking Len if he would do it, and Len repeated that he would. He didn't want to risk losing the most important person in his life. So Fred told his willing hitman that he wanted to return home to find his wife's dead body on the floor. For orchestrating this scenario, Fred promised Len that he would give him $30,000 and ensure his future career with the Mossad. I know Len isn't a good guy, but Fred is just the lowest type of human for preying on Len's obvious insecurities and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything Len goes on to do is excusable, but the way Fred manipulates him just makes me sad. Eager to claim these rewards, Len and Fred got down to planning Carol's murder, something Fred wanted done as soon as possible. They tossed out various methods and locations, such as killing her with a stun gun, shooting her and injuring Fred in front of a theater in New York, stabbing her with a knife, staging her murder in the Short Hills Mall's parking lot, and killing her with a gun when she was in Camden for the community service meetings she attended twice a month. Having discarded each option, in early June 1994, Fred gave Len his final instructions. He needed Carol to be killed in their home one Tuesday night. While his wife was being murdered, Fred would be establishing his alibi at Makor Shalom, and their son Matthew would be out of the way on his shift as an EMT for Cherry Hill Township. With Matthew currently living at home as a pre med student, Fred knew that the murder would need to happen during Matthew's Tuesday 12-hour shift from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m.
Did Fred think that maybe Matthew would be called to his home and witness his murdered mother during his EMT shift? Or was that the plan all along?
Honestly, I think he probably knew that would be the case and he just didn't care. Either way, the busier Matthew was at the time of his mother's death, the better, because he hadn't failed to sense the tension in his parents' relationship.
Only 2 nights before the murder would take place, Matthew hadn't just heard his parents' heated argument, he had been pulled into it. Carol had instructed Matthew to tell his father goodbye because he would be leaving the house permanently. But this finality wasn't her choice. Through tears, she asked her husband if he would be willing to work on their marriage by going to counseling, or if he was done and ready for a divorce. Fred didn't hesitate to reply that the relationship was over. Despite his resolution, when Matthew asked him if he was in fact leaving the following morning, Fred didn't bother to answer. Perhaps his head was too full of plans of murdering Matthew's mother to offer his son a response, and there was no doubt that he had given the gory details a lot of thought. He had come to the conclusion that killing Carol in their home would allow Len to stage it as a robbery gone wrong. He even had the foresight to warn Len to use a blunt object instead of a knife to make it appear as though the thief had been forced to use whatever was at hand. Still, his impatience to be rid of his wife posed another problem, but one that his hitman was prepared to push back on. Even though Fred was fine increasing the risk by having Carol killed that summer, Lynn insisted that they needed to hold out until fall, when the days were shorter and they could work under the cover of darkness, to which Fred reluctantly agreed.
But that wasn't the only one of Len's conditions. In the summer of 1994, Len told Fred he needed an accomplice. Even though Fred warned him that this person would be getting a cut of Len's $30,000, the following month, Len went ahead and invited 21-year-old Paul Michael Daniels, his roommate, to join the murder plot. Len had met Paul at a halfway house while they were both in an alcohol treatment program, and they had since moved into an apartment in Cherry Hill together. In addition to alcohol use disorder, Paul had struggled with substance use disorder since the age of 10, after horrifically being sexually abused by his father. Although he had gone through another treatment program for his addiction to cocaine and heroin, he had since relapsed. At the time, he was taking 3 prescription medications to treat what was later diagnosed as bipolar disorder and paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that included auditory hallucinations or voices. With all of these obstacles to overcome, while Paul didn't relish the thought of killing someone, once he heard about this $7,500, he jumped to the chance.
His accomplice secured, in the early fall, Fred and Len met in the Sheraton Hotel's parking lot in Cherry Hill, where Fred gave Len the first installment of $7,500 in cash stuffed into a manila envelope. Len removed $3,750, placed the stack of small bills into a brown paper lunch bag, and overturned the bag's contents onto Paul's head. When he got his share, Paul leaped up from where he was sitting and yelled, "The bitch is dead. The motherfucker is serious about killing his wife." He then used his ill gotten gains on girls, clothes, and drugs. Next, Fred gave Len a map of the inside of his home that he had drawn himself. We can't speak to the quality of this hand drawing, but it seems to have done the trick. To stage the robbery gone wrong, Fred told Len about the cash Carol kept in her burgundy purse that she took home from the Classic Cake Company. Although Carol had graduated with a degree in child and adolescent psychology, she went on to co found this Cherry Hill bakery and still manage the Classic Cake Company, even though she had since sold it to new owners. Fred instructed Len to steal the purse and the cash from the bakery it contained and leave Carol's diamond ring. He also told Len to stay downstairs and not go through anything. Fred made his priorities clear. He wanted to return home to a murdered wife, not a trashed house with furniture strewn all around the place.
When Len showed up for the AA meeting at Fred's synagogue at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, October 25th, 1994, he told the rabbi that they were ready to go. At around 8 that evening, Len met up with Paul and they drove to Fred's house. Fred had put in a dead light bulb, so they were greeted by a dark front porch to hide their entry. Dressed in dark colors and armed with a lead pipe, they carried a plain sealed envelope to make it appear to any random passerby or neighbors that they were simple delivery men.
Would, would passerbys not notice the lead pipe? You know, this makes me think of the game Clue. Was it Professor Plum in the conservatory with the lead pipe?
If only. I think Len hid the lead pipe under his clothes.
Probably. In my mind, it is just not super small, but I mean, he certainly could have hid it under a coat.
hmm Having driven up to the house, Len and Paul found Carol in her car on her cell phone. Len, rudely, interrupted her conversation by tapping on her window. After Carol lowered it to ask what Len needed, he told her about the delivery he had for Fred. Carol replied that Fred wasn't currently in, but offered to let Len into the home. It seemed like murdering Carol without any witnesses would be only too easy.
Poor trusting Carol.
I know.
But as we all know, if it seems like everything's going your way, it probably won't be for long. Having been invited into the home, Len started darting his eyes around to see if he could spot Carol's purse. Under the guise of going to the bathroom, he searched more desperately for the telltale burgundy color. Still unable to locate it, Len realized he couldn't murder Carol that night. Without stealing the purse, he wouldn't be able to sell the robbery angle. So he handed Carol the empty envelope with instructions to deliver it to the rabbi. Carol offered to let Len wait for Fred, but Len, with his plans scuppered, left the home in a hurry instead. Carol and Fred's daughter, Rebecca Neulander Rockoff, knew all about this bizarre interaction because she had been the person her mother was talking to in the car when she pulled into her driveway after having finished her weekly management meeting at the Classic Cake Company. Having called her back after the man left, Carol told the concerned Rebecca how odd it was that the man who was so insistent on giving the envelope to Fred had left it empty.
Fred was less than pleased with the turn of events. When they met the following day at the same Sheridan parking lot, he latched onto Len's collar and asked, "What the fuck happened?" Once Len told him that he left with his tail between his legs after failing to find the purse, Fred yelled at him about the $7,500 he had already given him and threatened that he better fucking kill her or I'll kill you. So that next Tuesday, November 1st, 1994, Len again arrived for the AA meeting at McCor Shalom and assured Fred that his wife would be dead in just a few hours. At around 8:30 that evening, well after Matthew had left the house at 6:40, Len made his excuses, drove away from the synagogue, and met up with his accomplice. To solidify his alibi, Fred, who had made himself more conspicuous by changing into a suit, stayed at Rabbi Mazzo's confirmation class until 9 p.m. Rabbi Mazzo noticed Fred's attendance because he hardly ever came to his classes and was unusually boisterous at that one. In yet more out of character behavior, Fred then went to Cantor Anita Hochman's choir practice and made his presence known with his lively demeanor.
Meanwhile, at a little after 8:30, Len and Paul left Len's car around the corner from Fred and Carol's home. With a lead pipe tucked away in the back pocket of his pants beneath his jacket, Len, with Paul in tow, approached the Newlanders' front door. Len knocked on the glass and watched Carol come closer as she chatted on her cell phone. Len again asked if Fred was there. Still on the phone, Carol let Len in to wait while Paul stayed outside. Once again, the person on the other end of the call was Rebecca, having called her mother for their daily chat. Rebecca wanted to know if the man at the front door was the same one who had wanted to use their bathroom a week earlier. She even heard Carol tell Len to have Paul come in from the cold and join them in the house. Although Rebecca offered to continue talking to Carol while the two men were there, Carol assured her daughter that there was no need. So Rebecca told her mother she would call her back later, not knowing she would never get to speak to her again.
After Carol had hung up, she led Len to the living room. They hadn't yet made it when he put his left hand on her shoulder to prevent her from turning around. He grabbed the lead pipe from his back pocket with his right hand and clubbed Carol in the back of the head with it. She crumpled to the floor, asking repeatedly why he was doing this, as blood began trickling from the wound. Paul rushed into the house and grabbed the weapon. As Carol was sprawled on the floor, he used it to hit her on the head over and over again. While Paul beat Carol to death with the lead pipe, Len retrieved her burgundy purse before returning to the living room to see if the deed was done. He came back to find blood pouring from not only the wounds on Carol's head, but also from her ears and nose. Amidst the gurgling and hissing noises emanating from Fred's gravely injured wife, Len and Paul raced away.
At around 9:30 that evening, Matthew, Carol and Fred's son, was less than 3 hours into his EMT shift when a radio call requested an ambulance to an address Matthew knew all too well. Probably panicked and confused, Matthew rushed home to help the unnamed bleeding victim. When he pulled the ambulance to a stop, he noticed that every light in his house seemed to be on, illuminating the police officers standing all around what had now turned into a crime scene. He jumped out of the driver's seat and flew up the driveway, running right past his father, who completely ignored his distraught son. Matthew made it all the way to the front door before two of his EMT friends stopped him and forced him away from the home. Fred, in his spotless suit, displayed none of his son's emotion. He didn't answer any of the questions directed at him and kept telling his son everything's going to be okay. But Matthew soon learned that everything was definitely not going to be okay. His mother had died. With his world forever changed, he started off down the street. His father let him walk away without a word. What an absolute piece of shit Fred is.
I know, I feel so sorry for his kids. The murder part of Fred's plan might have gone off without a hitch, but it seemed that he hadn't quite thought through the robbery angle. He may have gotten his wish, and having his furniture and upstairs rooms left exactly as he left them, but when Cherry Hill police officer Richard Bumborough got to the home nearly half an hour after Fred's 911 call and discovered Carol on the floor surrounded by blood, he was also quick to note the jewelry still on Carol, which included the gold and diamond necklace Fred had presented his wife with on a prior wedding anniversary. At first glance, it looked as if nothing had been taken. Between that and the lack of any indication of a break in, the whole burglary angle was a hard sell to any discerning investigator. As for the hitman, who had badly staged this burglary gone wrong, having returned to where they had parked, Len shoved the murder weapon along with a pair's bloody clothes into a duffel bag he had stowed in his car. Hours later, he would throw the clothes and lead pipe into a store dumpster by the Cherry Hill Mall. The purse, the only item they had actually taken, would need to be disposed of somewhere else to minimize their chances of getting caught. After taking out around $125, Len traveled to Philadelphia to leave it in a different dumpster. Paul's job was pretty much done as soon as he struck the final blow. And once Len had offered his accomplice $100 of the pilfered cash, Len left him in a parking lot, the very same one in which she had met him hours earlier.
With the hitmen sticking to their end of the deal, Fred continued to lay a false trail to confuse the investigation. When Sheila Goodman, the president of the synagogue, found out Carol had died, she, along with her husband Alan and two other members of Makor Shalom, named Stuart and Marilee Alpern, went over to his home. In response to Sheila asking how she had died, Fred claimed it was those Colombians, who apparently frequented the Classic K company. Hard up and violent, they must have known that Carol had a habit of taking money from work home, something Fred made sure to mention that he told her not to do. How very racist of him.
I mean, he might as well round out his horrible personality by adding in some racism.
Too true. In spite of outwardly seeming to have only the faintest idea of who his wife's killers had been, Fred's true relationship with his hitman was so friendly that when Paul later met Fred at the funeral home, Fred hugged the man who had murdered his wife and asked how he was doing. The answer was not well because Paul had tried to take his own life 3 separate times after killing Carol. Aware of this or not, Fred was over the moon to be rid of his wife, and he similarly hugged and asked after Len's welfare at Carol's funeral. When Len reciprocated the question, Fred echoed a version of what he had told his son after the attack when he replied, "Everything's going to be all right now. She's dead."
However, Fred's feeling of relief was not mirrored by the other mourners at his wife's funeral. Carol had been beloved, and the well attended funeral procession from Makor Shalom to Crescent Burial Park stretched out the 20-minute drive to an almost 60-minute journey. Crescent Burial Park was South Jersey's biggest Jewish cemetery, but some attendees at Carol's funeral were still forced to park along the road beside the cemetery or even on nearby side streets. As the ceremony drew to a close, Carol's family watched as her plain pine coffin was lowered into its final resting place beside Fred's deceased parents, Ernest and Sally Neulander. Once it lay still, her three adult children, along with the rest of those in attendance, somberly shoveled dirt onto her casket. After the mourner's Kaddish, a prayer that praises God and wishes for peace was recited, Fred, Rebecca, Matthew, and Benjamin all returned home. It wasn't just that her loved ones went back to the house in which Carol was murdered, though. No, they were forced to sit in the room in which the attack had taken place.
Because only days after her death, Fred was determined that Shiva, a 7 day span of mourning observed by the deceased's closest family members, would be observed in the very living room from which Carol's blood had just been removed. I wonder if he got a little thrill from that.
I'm sure he did.
In attendance at this ritual were two of the men who had brought about her violent death. Beverly Weiss, a member of Makor Shalom, remembered that the man in a folding chair beside the leather one in which Fred was sitting was Leonard Jenoff. Beverly wouldn't learn how repugnant Len's presence was for some time, though, because at first the murder plot appeared to have worked. After Fred told Len that he couldn't just give him the money, he pretended to hire Len as a private investigator looking into his wife's attack. And this wasn't even an invented fake career for the hitman. Len had previously worked for numerous other PIs in the 1980s and struck out on his own after gaining years of experience. Once he was licensed, Len was mainly employed by insurance companies who hired him to look into claims and question witnesses. Using his established career to hide the transaction with legitimate looking bills, from March 30th, 1995 to October 1998, Fred, with his lawyer as his unwitting accomplice, secretly paid his hitman back in installments.
As Fred slowly paid Len off, the two regularly discussed the ongoing police investigation, which, despite what they may have hoped, didn't look like it was winding down anytime soon. When Len received a subpoena to testify in front of a grand jury in 1997, he and Fred developed a game plan for what he would say, ultimately deciding that there was no other option. He had to lie or they'd both be facing prison time. Even though the relationship now had a professional slant as they conspired to get away with their crimes, Fred was still Len's rabbi and friend. So when Len got married in August 1997, Rabbi Neulander officiated the ceremony held in the very room in which Carol had been murdered.
Jesus, are there no other rooms in that house?
It does make you wonder, but speaking as someone who doesn't have people over, I guess you'd mainly have events in the living room?
That is true, but it's so morbid. I mean, was there not a dining room or a TV room?
I mean, like you said, I'm sure he's probably getting a thrill out of it.
I'm sure.
Fred may not have known it during the ceremony, but his days as a free man were numbered. And a little over a year after the celebration, in September 1998, Fred Neulander was arrested for being an accessory to murder and conspiracy to murder.
It turned out that Fred hadn't been as careful as he thought he'd been. He'd floated the idea of hiring a hitman to the wrong person, one he had assumed was as morally corrupt as he was. Nearly 2 weeks before Carol was killed, Fred had been playing a game of racquetball with Myron Pepe Levin. When Myron, because we just can't call him Pepe, noticed that Fred didn't seem to have his mind on the game, he asked if something was bothering him. Perhaps Fred, who knew all about this friend's prior conviction and time in prison on federal charges, had doubts about his current hitman and thought this was his chance to find a real professional because he responded by throwing his racket to the floor and confessing, "I wish I could come home to find my wife dead, spread out on the floor." Myron, as most people would be, was taken aback. When Fred asked if Myron had any criminal connections who could make this happen, Myron, thinking of Fred's blameless wife and kids, told him that he wasn't getting involved. As soon as he was out of the gym, Myron recounted this incident to his shocked driver, Anthony Federici. We should mention, though, that Anthony later told the police and a grand jury that this conversation never happened because he too didn't want anything to do with it.
Yet, as forthcoming as Myron was to his driver, he wasn't nearly as talkative to authorities. In his formal statement to police in March 1995, nearly 5 months after the murder, and in his grand jury testimony, Myron claimed that Fred had never asked to be put in contact with the hitman. However, Myron later disclosed Fred's murderous impulses after he found out that Fred was going to buy a Warsaw Torah with the $20,000 Myron had donated that was worth only a tenth of the amount. His attorney, Jamie Kai, had had months to prepare for Myron's changed tune because Myron had told him about Fred's remark way back in December 1994, adding that it was keeping him up at night. All of that sounds like Myron was trying to clear his conscience. Jamie Kai told a fellow attorney that the prosecution said they would indict his client for murder if he didn't play ball, implying improper conduct rather than Myron voluntarily coming forward with the truth.
Myron's girlfriend, Cynthia Sharp Myers, was similarly reticent. Myron had told her before Carol's death about his conversation with Fred, yet, even though she was an attorney and thus presumably familiar with the law, when the police first questioned her at her office in 1995, she claimed to have never heard about Fred's statements before. But she did come to her senses in October 1997 when she gave a sworn statement to the Camden County Prosecutor's Office, in which she said that she had thought Myra had made the outlandish conversation up, which sounds like bullshit. This isn't a group of teens thinking one of their peers talking about murder is just talk. They are adults, and she was an attorney.
Too fucking right.
That flimsy excuse didn't seem to hold up, though, because by the time Fred went to trial, an ethics complaint was looming over Cynthia, and good.
Uh-huh.
The year Cynthia admitted to knowing about Fred's comments, an article appeared in the newspaper saying that Myron Pepe Levin had testified against Fred in front of the same grand jury Lynn had lied to. Fred reacted by calling Myron a traitor and asking Lynn to kill for him once more. Armed with the knowledge that Myron had already experienced multiple heart attacks, Fred wondered aloud if Lynn's stun gun could be used directly on Myron's heart to finish him off. After Lynn told Fred that he didn't know if that would work, Fred dismissed the entire idea.
Just as Fred had overplayed his hand in asking Myron for a hitman, he had overestimated his artistic talent when it came to painting his infidelities in a more palatable light.
That painted a nice picture.
Thanks. Because, surprise, surprise, Fred hadn't only cheated with Elaine, and he wasn't exactly hiding these indiscretions. Soon after they rang in 1995 without their mother, Rebecca went to her father and told him she knew all about his many affairs. He admitted to both her and Matthew that he had cheated on their mother with various women. After he and Carol began to grow apart in 1992, Fred started sleeping with other women, including those in his congregation. Fred even explained to Matthew that the affair he was having at the time of Carol's death was serious. However, he also told his son that Carol agreed to Fred seeking gratification outside of their marriage due to their sexual incompatibility. Matthew knew better, though. He was positive that Carol would never have gone along with this.
Of course she wouldn't. And why would he be discussing this with his son?
I think to make sure Matthew didn't correctly identify that as a reason his father would have wanted their mother dead.
Whatever, father of the year.
Yeah. This happened to be the same shaky story Fred shared with several of his colleagues, including Stuart and Mary Lee Alperin, Associate Rabbi Gary Mazzo, Sheila Goodman, and Anita Hockman. Mary Lee, who had founded the congregation along with Fred, was so convinced that Carol wouldn't have consented to an open marriage that when her husband Stuart told her Fred had said the same to him at the choir practice he used as part of his alibi the night of Carol's murder, Mary Lee confronted Fred and was unconvinced by his repeated claim that Carol was totally fine with it.
How many people did he think he needed to share this false info with? I get it was to make it look like it was an agreement and he wasn't cheating, but really?
In my opinion, it very much comes down to Fred believing that everyone will believe whatever he says.
Of course, he is definitely the smartest person in every room.
Of course.
But besides Stewart, every single one of Fred's colleagues said that Carol was not someone who would have agreed to Fred sleeping with other women. Maybe this was the push Fred needed to realize how unbelievable this narrative was, because at first he denied cheating to the police. He described his marriage as steady, before later coming clean about his infidelities. Once investigators found out about Fred's faithlessness months after Carol's murder, he resigned from Makor Shalom, the very thing he had committed murder to avoid. Still, the whole truth wouldn't come out until April 28th, 2000, around a year and a half after Fred was arrested, when Lynn finally owned up to what the three men had done. Lynn had originally spoken with Nancy Phillips, a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who was writing about Carol's murder on Fred, his employer's behalf. However, when he told her that he had been withholding many of the key details, such as that he had been hired to kill Carol by Fred, Nancy convinced Lynn to come forward before Fred's trial began a month later in May 2000. Having met with police and prosecutors at a diner in Cherry Hill 3 days after that, Lynn gave a full confession to the murder he and Paul had carried out on Fred's instructions to the Camden County Prosecutor's Office. Only days later, on May 1st, Lynn wore a wire while talking to Paul. Paul was having none of it for nearly 20 minutes and kept telling Lynn to be quiet. But finally, Lynn got Paul to clamber along beside him on the truth telling train.
Paul's account of the fateful plot mostly aligned with Len's. While he claimed that Len initially asked him to help murder the wife of a vending machine man, Paul amended this to say that he later found out that the woman in question was actually Fred's wife. As for what happened the night of the attack, Paul said that he had hit Carol at least twice with the lead pipe while on drugs. Although both Paul and Len would eventually admit to having hit Carol more than 4 times in total with the pipe, a medical examiner stated that she had been struck more than a dozen times. Whether they were trying to minimize the brutality of the killing, or if they had truly forgotten and or blocked out the extent of their violent actions is anyone's guess. 4 days after he recorded his conversation with Paul, Len provided a recorded statement about all that Fred had asked him to do. A couple of months later, on June 1st, 2000, Leonard Jenoff entered a guilty plea to the charge of first-degree aggravated manslaughter. A week later, his accomplice, Paul Daniels, also pled guilty to first-degree aggravated manslaughter and first-degree robbery, the latter charge stemming from stealing Carol's purse. Both would also soon testify against Fred to avoid the possibility of being handed a harsher sentence. After his hitmen turned against him to save themselves, as human beings are wont to do, the charges of being an accessory to murder and conspiracy to murder brought against Fred 2 years before were changed to the greater charge of capital murder. And buckle up because we're about to cruise through 2 different trials to find out Fred's fate.
Fred's first trial began in the middle of October 2001. His two attorneys, Dennis Wigstead and Jeffrey Zucker, attempted to suppress Len's testimony by claiming that he lived in a fantasy world of his own making and wasn't credible. When that didn't work, Fred's defense switched tactics by trying to pin the blame firmly on Len. One witness they relied on in attempting this strategy was David Thomas Beardsley, Len's cellmate at the Camden County Jail. David testified that Len had confronted Nancy Phillips, the reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who convinced Len to come forward over the phone, saying that she had gone back on her word since he should have been given immunity. Lynn supposedly stated that Fred had never been involved and that it had been a robbery gone wrong, which is what Fred has always alleged, but that the Camden County prosecutor forced Lynn to implicate him. Apparently, Lynn also told David that he had helped murder a different woman in Camden County as well. To top it all off, Lynn and Nancy were supposedly lovers, and Nancy had been stringing him along with the promise of sex and a Pulitzer Prize for the book they co authored. If you can't tell by the tone, we don't put much stock in this version of events, and no one besides the defense seemed to either. Nancy herself said that all Lynn was to her was a legitimate source.
David, incidentally, was due to be sentenced at the time of the trial after pleading guilty to child endangerment and second degree sexual assault. This fine specimen of humanity ended up with a 20-year sentence to be served at Southwood State Prison in Bridgeton, New Jersey. He claimed to have felt compelled to confess what Len had said because he, a Christian author, couldn't stand Len's disregard for the innocent rabbi he had implicated.
I mean, does he have some swamp land to sell too?
That's good. Maybe he can make that offer to a different inmate some other time. No one else could speak to these statements from Len since he and David were out of earshot of anyone else at the time. Having been sentenced on May 12, 2000, David came forward during the 5 years he was ineligible for parole. And I'm not saying all jailhouse confessions are unreliable, but I am saying that David lied, likely for some kind of privilege, but perhaps simply because he was bored and a dick.
I mean, he certainly wasn't a stand up guy.
Definitely not. To hammer home the robbery gone wrong theory, Fred's defense had another questionable source in the form of fellow inmate James Keeney, who testified that he had met Len on June 7th, 2000, at the county jail, where Len again said that it had been a burglary that ended in an unplanned murder, which Fred knew nothing about. Len had told James that he had given Paul the weapon to keep Carol cooperative, all while Len searched the cache. But Paul apparently lost it while he was gone and killed her with a single blow from the lead pipe. In case you were wondering, when he testified, James was being held at Bayside State Prison after being convicted of burglary in 2000.
As opposed to what others claimed, the hitmen had said, Lynn and Paul themselves ended up testifying against Fred by naming him as the mastermind behind the murder. Additionally, Robin Gross Report told the courtroom that she had been in a relationship with Fred, her married rabbi, between 1992 and 1994, the same time he was with Elaine. Robin remembered a conversation during which she recounted to Fred how she had passed Carol on the highway. Having learned of this encounter, Fred charmingly asked, "Why didn't you run her off the road?" Carol's sister, Margaret Mila, was the last witness called to the stand by Camden County First Assistant Prosecutor James Lynch. She told the jury how the day after his wife was murdered, Fred didn't appear to be mourning. One of Fred's lawyers, Jeffrey Zucker, did his job by pointing out that everyone grieves differently. But Margaret referenced her 30 years as a medical social worker to underscore how odd Fred's behavior was. And go, Margaret.
Yeah.
Closing arguments were made, and the jury was left to consider all that they had seen and heard. The prosecution and the defense were left waiting and waiting. After 11 days of deliberation, the jurors still hadn't come to a unanimous decision, and it ended in a mistrial on November 13th, 2001. Fred's defense had failed to persuade the jurors that established liar Lynn had blamed Fred for his own gain.
Following the intense media interest by Philadelphia area outlets that dominated the first trial, which likely wasn't helped by Fred publishing his memoir on his time as a rabbi called Keep Your Mouth Shut and Your Arms Open, Observations from the Rabbinic Trenches, under the pseudonym Adam Ploney. Superior Court Judge Linda G. Baxter decided that the retrial would be held in Monmouth County, New Jersey.
I hope no one bought his book.
Sadly, it has 2.9 stars on Amazon. The memoirist's second trial took place the following year, And his new attorney, Michael Riley, was determined to succeed where Fred's previous lawyers had failed. He went hard after 55-year-old Len by emphasizing the lies he had been telling for years and had even begun to believe himself, including that he had worked at the CIA for nearly 14 years. Len had originally put these falsehoods on his resume and his application for his New Jersey private investigator license to enhance his credentials. He knew that because the CIA is less forthcoming with employment history than your local car wash, claims like these would be harder to verify. Len again confessed that many of these lies stemmed from his low self esteem.
Maybe everybody should put that on the resume.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for Lynn, the lies he had used to improve his image were elaborate and varied enough that Fred's lawyer didn't have to try that hard to poke holes in his credibility. Some of his claims were not outlandish enough to raise too many eyebrows, such as that he had graduated from college, but some were so impressive, read unbelievable, that Lynn seemed, if not delusional, at least untrustworthy. Lynn had said that President Ronald Reagan had given him a photo on which he wrote, "To Len Genoff, a comrade in arms, Reagan," that he had been a member of the President's Commission on Organized Crime, gotten a meritorious service commendation, and had worked as an informant for the Baltimore Police Department for 2 years. Lynn really hadn't done himself any favors in adding that the CIA had asked that he use his job as a Playboy executive casino host to embed himself in a network of narco terrorists. Lynn portrayed himself as so well placed that he had testified in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee, had been part of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, and had been asked by foreign nationals how to get the necessary materials to make a nuclear weapon, which he had, of course, reported to the FBI.
To be fair, Len had met with the FBI several times in 1994 to see if he could remain a US citizen while working for the Mossad, which Fred had promised to help him with. But Fred's lawyer used these meetings to underscore Len's belief in his own lies and his lack of concern that anyone would ever get to the truth of them, even if he managed to become a government informant and presumably found himself under a higher level of scrutiny. As his lawyer called him CIA Lenny to infer that Len's habit of rewriting his history meant that he had similarly imagined Fred's involvement in the murder plot, Fred used a legal folder to hide himself from the camera in the courtroom and largely ignored everyone in the gallery. Yet, in spite of going after the lies Len had relied on to advance his career, Fred's defense explained away the payments Fred and his attorneys had made to him by pulling out the invoices for the legitimate investigative work Len had supposedly been hired to do. More than 3 years of work culminated in a number of checks that added up to thousands of dollars. Len reiterated that all this money had really been for murdering Carol. His profession as a private investigator was simply the cover he and Fred used to evade the police.
Although Mike O'Reilly highlighted the fact that the jury had to take Lynn's unreliable word for the many meetings in 1994 in which he and Fred planned Carol's murder, the confession Lynn provided 2 years prior to this second trial remained unchanged. The prosecution's argument was similarly straightforward. The rabbi had had his wife murdered after Elaine said she wanted to end the affair. He didn't want to lose his job, his reputation, or his lover. So he hired two hitmen to solve what he saw as the problem, his wife. Like Len and Paul, Elaine also testified against him, as she had done in his first trial. In fact, it was reading Fred's testimony from his first trial that jogged her memory and had her coming forward to say that Fred had been attempting to secure Len a job with the Israeli consulate. While on the stand, Elaine described Fred's role in the plot and her fear that Fred had played a part in his wife's murder and wouldn't hesitate to have the same done to her. She claimed that her shock over the killing Fred had orchestrated had kept her quiet for 3 years until she finally allowed herself to remember everything that had taken place. Because even though Elaine had admitted to the affair, She hadn't told the police about Fred's incriminating comments during the numerous times she was questioned soon after the murder. She only shared them with a grand jury in 1997.
But Michael Riley wasn't interested in simply rehashing Elaine's affair with Fred. He wanted to highlight another of her romantic relationships, one that concerned a Cherry Hill police officer. Because in a twist that could have helped Fred's cause, Officer Lawrence Leaf, who had first hailed Elaine Sonsini, then protected her after she had confessed to the affair and became worried about Fred's reaction, had entered into a relationship with her on December 17th, 1994, only days after he had started guarding her. December 17th also happened to be her birthday and the date by which Fred said they'd be a real couple. And Elaine had indeed found a man with whom she could become serious. It just wasn't Fred. Lawrence and Elaine soon started planning their wedding, and they got married 6 months later in June 1995. Although Officer Leaf reported his relationship with Elaine, Internal Affairs launched an investigation since he had been observed thumbing through the related police files while Carol's murder was being investigated. Unluckily for Fred, Internal Affairs concluded that Officer Leaf had not leaked information to Elaine that could have compromised the investigation.
Having questioned the investigation, Michael Riley turned his attention back to casting doubt on the murder plot. He had Paul and Lynn's roommate, Richard Plum, who they had met at the same halfway house while in addiction recovery, testify that the two broke men didn't appear to come into possession of any substantial amount of money. That didn't mean Lynn hadn't spotted a different way to get his hands on some cash, though. Fellow AA meeting attendee James Rooney claimed that Lynn had told him that he had confessed for the publicity. James said that Lynn thought he would be seen as the good guy, bringing Fred down, and would go on to star in television interviews like with Barbara Walters and receive lucrative book and movie deals. Circumstantial evidence abounded, but it was finally time to talk about the forensics. The autopsy findings would reveal what exactly Fred had done to his wife. Robert Siegel, a retired medical examiner from Camden, New Jersey, explained that Carol had numerous skull fractures, 7 lacerations to the top of her head, and various defensive wounds, which included the ring finger of her right hand being crushed in the struggle. Ultimately, her cause of death was blunt force trauma after the beating from the lead pipe led to her horrifically choking on her own vomit.
The man at the blackened heart of it all abstained from taking the stand in both his trials. Yet, in spite of this strategic move and all of the convoluted threads his defense attempted to weave, Fred's second trial ended on November 20th, 2002, with the jury finding the 61-year-old guilty of capital murder, felony murder, and second-degree conspiracy to commit murder for hiring two hitmen to kill Carol 8 years and 19 days earlier. 2 days after his conviction, Fred called upon his faith in an effort to save his life when he asked the jury not to hand down the death sentence. In addition to referencing the book of Genesis, he said about Carol, I have acknowledged for the longest time my behavior that was reprehensible and disgraceful, and yet you must believe I love her and loved her. This didn't go down as well as he thought it would, and the gasps of his wife's siblings echoed around the courtroom. Still, Fred was undeterred and promised to use his time in prison to encourage literacy among his fellow inmates. Having considered that Fred's age would likely mean he would not live to become eligible for parole if he received a life sentence, his history of service, and his lack of a prior criminal record, the jury failed to come to a unanimous decision on the death penalty. As a result, Fred was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 30 years.
I may just be petty, but helping inmates read doesn't mean you should get a lighter sentence. Also, our justice system is obviously flawed. But just because you have no prior criminal records and the first time you decide to give crime a go, you manipulate and plan the murder of your wife doesn't equate to a lighter sentence. Because of his age, I realize it is most likely a life sentence, but I still don't love the possibility of parole.
Me neither, but spoiler, he doesn't get it, so I'm not too upset about it.
Good. Fred has appealed more than once throughout the years, but each time his contentions were rejected and his conviction was upheld. He reached the end of the line in 2016 when the New Jersey Supreme Court decided they wouldn't hear the case following a state appellate court's rejection of the appeal in 2012. Having been in prison since January 2003, one of Fred's defense attorneys from his first trial, Dennis Wixted, said his client has not only continued to claim that he played no part in his wife's death, but that he also never stopped offering religious counsel. He simply switched to advising community members to counseling fellow prisoners. Fred has refused to relinquish the title of rabbi, which denotes a teacher of Judaism, as seen in the interviews he's given from behind bars. And no surprise there.
Classic narcissist to the core.
It isn't hard to imagine that the regret he has expressed for his affair with Elaine comes more from the damage it did to his life and reputation, a reputation he was intent on upholding by continuing to proclaim his innocence, than from his wife's murder. Fortunately, as opposed to with A.B. Shermer, Fred's children do not believe that their father was wrongly convicted of killing their mother. Matthew and Rebecca even testified against Fred.
And kudos to them.
Definitely, that had to have been hard on them.
No doubt about that. Insisting upon his innocence until the last, on Wednesday, April 17th, 2024, 82-year-old Fred Neulander was discovered unresponsive in New Jersey State Prison's infirmary unit. After both CPR and an automated external defibrillator were attempted, Fred was transported to a nearby Trenton hospital where he died at 6:13 p.m. Some have tried to strike out their shared history with Fred. In 2022, Congregation Makor Shalom was combined with Temple Emmanuel, and the two now operate under the name Congregation Kolami. While Fred's position was terminated when his role in his wife's death came to light, the new name attempts to erase his affiliation even further.
And who could blame them for that?
Not me. Elaine, too, decided to move on. She left her hosting job at WPEN after 20 years in 2000 to enjoy her retirement in Florida. However, on February 1st, 2010, she went back to work with a role starring alongside Mike Bowie on 1340 What. She is still married to former Cherry Hill police officer Lawrence or Larry Leaf, and they've even done voice-over work together.
Others will always be tied to the plot, such as those who were instrumental in Carol's murder. Having served their time, both Lynn and Paul were released in 2014 after serving nearly 14 years of a maximum 23-year sentence for aggravated manslaughter. Although Paul was also convicted of robbery and given another 20 years, his sentences were served concurrently at the request of Carol's siblings, so that both he and Lynn would serve the same amount of time. Even though they asked for Paul to be given a shorter sentence, that didn't mean Carol's family didn't hold the two men responsible for her murder. They understandably wished the two had been convicted of a greater charge. As her brother Edward Litz said, no one forced them to enter Carol's home and take her life. They did it to get the money. Simply put, they accepted a price for a human life set by Fred. They may have told the truth when it was in their best interest and perhaps even felt genuine remorse, but no one can argue that they have Carol's blood on their hands. Before he was sentenced, Paul got 2 teardrop tattoos on his face to remember Carol and his decisive role in having been the one to kill her. However, Lynn's road to release has been filled with shifting stories. In 2009, he claimed that he really had killed Carol in a robbery gone wrong and that authorities had forced him to implicate Fred. But he then switched back to his original narrative, saying he had only gone back on it because he thought it might get him released earlier and because he felt for Fred, whom he still believed changed his life. Still, Lynn's recantation was grounds for one of Fred's many rejected appeals.
Even in recent years, interest in the case hasn't waned. In 2022, despite Rebecca, Matthew, and Benjamin's pleas, a musical based on the murder called A Wicked Soul in Cherry Hill was staged in Los Angeles. The Neulander children weren't the only ones to object to it either. A few months before it became Congregation Kolami, Makor Shalom's president, Drew Molotsky, said it exploited the tragedy. Having originally said the play demonstrated humor and chutzpah, the Los Angeles theater at which it was produced, Gaffin Playhouse, later stated that the play does not downplay the murder, but instead looks at how the community came through the tragedy. The theater added that Matt Schatz, the playwright, is a native of South Jersey and portrayed the crime in a heartfelt way.
I just call bullshit on that. I think that it's gross. A musical about murder in a heartfelt way. Okay.
Honestly, I'd have less of a problem with it if the kids hadn't objected, but I think their wishes should have been respected.
Of course they should have. It's their life, not entertainment.
Definitely. On a less controversial note, Matthew, who was a pre med student at the time of Carol's murder, has since become a doctor and moved to North Carolina.
That makes me happy.
Me too. Okay, I have to add that I don't think Elaine was involved, and even if she did only come forward about their affair after she found out that Fred had been with other women, which I wouldn't bet money on since she too was seeing other men while with Fred, I still don't blame her for the murder. Was it great that she was having an affair with him? No. Does that mean she wanted Carol dead? Also, no. Maybe this is an inaccurate impression, but I think Fred's vague comments about wanting Carol's car to fall into the river or for her to magically disappear make me less suspicious of Elaine than someone like Vanessa Bowles, who knew the exact date Matt planned to kill Carrie. Ultimately, Len and Paul carried out the deed, but in my opinion, Fred wasn't any less culpable. He was the instigator, and I won't lose any sleep at night about him dying in prison.
Definitely. And I agree. Lynn and Paul carried out the murder. But like Tracy Burleson, Fred was the instigator and master manipulator. Regarding Elaine, I don't think she knew what he was planning. His comments were vague and sounded like wishful thinking.
100% agree. Next week, we'll be continuing our series on religious leaders who kill family members when we discuss the case of preacher Anthony Hopkins.
All the sources we used for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifyingly Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifyingly Typical Pod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.